Alrighty, we're going to answer the question, how to make oyster bisque. Now that's the one bisque of the bisques that are in this series that you have least likely to probably have encountered. And it is made exactly the way the other bisques are made, with the exception of the primary ingredient is oysters, instead of lobster or shrimp or crayfish. So we're going to start this out just like we started out all the other ones, and that is with whole butter in your pot. And mirepoix, the recipe that you have, the ingredient list calls for 1 cup each celery, carrots, and onions, which is what I have here, diced mirepoix. And we're going to put a little bit more butter in there. And some dried leaf thyme. And we're going to put a little bit of pepper and a little bit of salt in here. Now, if I appear mechanical in the way I make this bisque, it's because I've made them so many times, and I always make them the same way. I always cook mirepoix, add some garlic and some spices or whatever it is I'm going to add the primary ingredient, cook it a little bit, add white wine, reduce it, add stock, add rice, bring it to a boil, puree it, reduce it, cream it, and season it. It's always the same, and it always turns out good if you follow this particular formula. So we're going to put a little bit of fresh ground pepper in there, just a touch, because again, you're always keeping in mind that you don't want to add final seasonings that are going to affect the final outcome of the soup too early, because there's reducing involved and so on and so forth. I mean, in terms of salt and pepper. Okay? Alrighty, now we're going to let that cook for about 3 or 4 minutes. We're going to time elapse this and come right back in 3 or 4 minutes. So we'll be back right now. That 3 or 4 minutes has passed, and I've been standing here babysitting the pot. And I just wanted to show you that the mirepoix, the celery, carrots, and onions, are cooked 1/2 to 3/4 of the way. Now, what you want to be careful that you don't do is you're not browning these vegetables. This is not a brown soup per se. You're just cooking them until they're almost tender enough to eat in this particular case. Now we're going to put the garlic in the soup. And I'd call that the prescribed amount based on the ingredient list, of course, you know. And the oysters. Now I have here, and you should be able to buy these in just about every local supermarket in the country has these fresh oysters. And these are in what they call the oyster liqueur. Now keep in mind that the oyster liqueur, and I'll dump these in here so you can see how they come. They come by the cup, but the container is actually 8 ounces, so it's 1/2 pound each. Now these are big, nice big oysters too. These are nice, and they smell good. My point about the liqueur, which is important to understand when you're making this particular soup, being sure not to burn your garlic, of course, is that the oyster liqueur, here, let me dump this in here. Oyster liqueur is the liquid essence of the oyster, and it needs to be part of this. If, for example, you are shucking oysters in a shell, make sure that you save what's called the oyster liqueur, which is what that is, okay? Now, we're going to give that a little stir. And I'm going to time elapse this forward about 3 or 4 minutes, just enough time for the oysters to cook. Then I'm going to bring you right back in, and we're going to put the rice and the chicken stock on it, and we're going to let it simmer. So I'm going to let it cook now for 3 or 4 minutes, and we'll be back in 3 or 4 minutes right now. Okay, that 3, 4, 5, 6 minutes, give or take, has elapsed, and I want you to take a peek at the oysters. They're 1/2 to 3/4 of the way cooked. All righty. You got that oyster liqueur in there. That pot smells very nice. It smells like fresh oysters. One of the things about this soup that you're going to like if you make it is if you like oysters, this is like drinking oysters a little bit in the soup. Unlike every other soup I've had where the oysters tend to be whole in chowders and things like that, they taste good, but they only kind of taste like oyster a lot when you're eating one of the oysters. In this particular soup, every spoonful tastes like oyster, which is kind of neat. All right, so now I'm going to put the white wine on it and reduce that briefly. That would be the prescribed amount, I think, based on the ingredient list. And I'm going to time-elapse this again, and we're going to reduce the wine by 75%, and I'll be back in about 5 more minutes again with a time-elapsed reduced pot. Okay, that 5-7 minutes has elapsed, and the white wine has now been reduced by 75%, and this pot is now ready for the rice, which is the small amount of rice that you're going to use as a thickening agent for the bisque. Throughout this series, in the bisque soups, we have used rice in each case to thicken the soup, along with the pureed vegetable and so on that happens to be in there. So, we're going to add the rice. And you got to be careful when you add rice to this, because that's plenty of rice to start with, because you want to make sure you don't put too much rice in, because you puree it, it's too thick. And here, let me add this chicken stock to it. This recipe calls for about 1.5 quarts. This recipe calls for about 1 quart and a cup, 5 cups, give or take, which is about what's in there. We're going to let that come to a simmer and let it boil, but as I was starting to say, if you should happen to put too much rice inside the bisque soup and then you puree it, if it's too thick, you have to dilute it with something. And when you dilute it with whatever it is you dilute it with, you're going to dilute the flavor. So the name of the game here is to add the amount of rice, probably less than you think you need. Now, my recipe and that formula will work in all cases, but in every single case of a soup like this, you still have to make a texture adjustment at the end of it. You have to look at it, decide whether or not it's too thick, too thin. Should it be reduced some more? Should I add a little cornstarch to it, or whatever it is you want to add to it, a little pinch of roux or whatever it is? You're still going to have to make that decision, but you want to avoid making it too thick on the very front end. So I'm extending caution to you when you make this, that's how you should approach the process. Putting in a little bit less than you think you need. You can always add a little more to it. All right, we're going to time-elapse this and let it boil for 10 minutes or so, give or take. You give the stock time to become part of the whole soup, and everything will be like soft and pureeable. As soon as it's pureeable, then we're going to puree it, and then we're going to finish it off. So I'll be back in 5-8 minutes, something like that, right now. All right, we're back at the time that has elapsed is approximately about 7 to 9 minutes we took off there. And this stock has been simmering with the rice and the mirepoix and the oysters in it, and the garlic and the reduced white wine. And now we're going to put it in a cylindrical container, something that would be a little bit more conducive to it pureeing more effectively, okay? In a big pot like this, it's harder to puree it unless you have a real powerful puree stick, okay? Okay, we're going to take our, what I call the zapper, and give this a zap. One of the things you'll notice when you're making oyster bisque versus shrimp or lobster, which would be the two most popular ones, and the ones that are made by the most people, is the oyster bisque, because there's a little bag inside of each oyster that when it's pureed, it causes the soup to become green, a little bit, a shade of green. So that's what you should be looking for in your soup. Some oysters, of course, will cause it to be more green than others, so they're not all going to be exactly the same shade.